wouldn't you know it? I put my chin on my glasses.
I heard howling in the night. Oh. You got the background. Perfect.
We'll get started in a moment, guys. Forgive me if you hear Tejano music in the background, as one of our neighbors
It's completely outside of our control.
decided to have a super awesome dance party. Not invited.
They decided to celebrate Day of the Dead, just a little too early.
I mean, huh?
Woody has taken an ectoplasm shit on your door in honor of Halloween.
So,
Let me spread the word about you.
finish. Pulls. Put my mic on. Sure, you can probably find that. By the way, don't connect to look at videos or anything. Apparently, that kills it. At least that's what happened a moment ago. This jacket's gonna get hot really fast. But my wife bought this for me and I want to wear it. How does it sound in chat? Can y'all hear me okay? Plus we probably need to get some more fire or wood on that fire because it's slowly dying. We'll wait for Fireboy to come out. Yes, Alex is Fireboy. So, let's start with some scary stories to tell in the dark by our good friend Alvin Schwartz with the super awesome drawings by Stephen Gamble that gave us all nightmares when we were children. Our buddy Zappa Slages that made it so he was unable to read the story that went with it. Let's see if we can find that picture. Oh yeah, that one. If you can see that. I mean, I can't say I blame him. That is a...
It looks like she's staring at you from it.
Yeah, that is a scary ass picture. So I'm probably gonna look hunched over. I gotta use the to read. So let's start with the one that picture goes along with. So it's called The Haunted House. One time a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. It had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they would always get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house. Went on in, built himself a good fire. We got one of those. And lit a lamp. We got that too. This isn't going to end well. And so he just sat there reading the Bible. Then just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth. Then it sounded like someone was trying to scream and got choked off. And then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easily, like there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little bit, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went back to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, and he saw the doorknob turn and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do, and then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he he didn't hear any noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before the haunt started up again, slowly. Step, 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 closer and closer, step, step, and it was right at the door. The preacher stood up, held his Bible out before him. And then the knob slowly turned and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled. The flesh was dropping off her face so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs. There was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. Told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said the preacher would her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of her little finger from her hand and to lay it in the collection plate the next day at church. And then he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight and I'll tell you where my money is hidden. And then you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down into the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate as he was asked, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder and they took him off to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big sack of money where the haunt had held on to his coat. The print of those bony fingers was burned right to the cloth. It never did come out. So let's switch to something a bit more. Well, I mean, that was not a kiddie ghost story for sure.
At all.
But let's get to some H.P. Lovecraft, because I do love me some H.P. Lovecraft. So I'm going to read you my favorite H.P. Lovecraft short story.
Any comments from chat? Super low?
Hopefully the stream didn't die. One. I've never read that one. It sounds interesting. But I want to read Dunwich Horror. That's my... Okay, the Dunwich Horror. Actually, version of this wasn't... I don't remember these stories. We're going to read it. Some of these stories might not be super short stories. They might be medium length stories. You know, we're the trilogy. Oh, you know, Lord of the Rings.
That is, unless chat wants to.
No, we're not doing that.
No, okay.
Did I get the wrong page? Because I'm not seeing it.
What story are you looking for?
Dunwich Horror. Let's see. Because I just saw it. Dunwich Horror, 633. $6.33. Better not be lying to me. There it is. Right. Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. When a traveler in north central Massachusetts takes the wrong mark at the juncture of Salisbury, just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher, the briar-bordered stone walls press closer and closer against the ruts of the dusty curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belt seem too large, and the wild and bold grasses attain luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, planted fields and gilder, few and barren, while the sparsely scattered are a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask direction from the gnarled solitary figures spied now and then on crumbling doorsteps or on the sloping rock-strewn meadows. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things with which it would be better to have nothing to do with. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The sides are too rounded and symmetrical to give the sense of comfort and natural. Sometimes the silky silhouette specialist circled with rounds. Gorges and ravines of problematic depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem of dubious. Again, the marsh ending for chatter and profusion to dance and creepily and strident pipe bullfrogs, and scatonic birches oddly serpent suggest as the wind's feet of domed hill, among which, as the near crown top, the sides loom up so darkly that one wishes they would keep their distance, but the road by which to escape them. Across a covered bridge one sees a small village huddled between the stream and the vertical slope of the round mountain, and wonders at the cluster of rotting bramble wolves bespeaking an earlier architectural period of that of the neighboring region. It's not reassuring to see on a closer glance that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of the hamlet. One dreads to trust the tenebrous tunnel of the bridge, and yet there's no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to preserve the impression of the faint malign odor about the village street, as of the massed mold and decay of centuries. It is always a relief to get clear of the place, and to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level country beyond till it rejoins the Aylesbury Pike. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has to have been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing to it have been taken down. Scenery judged by any ordinary aesthetic canon is more commonly beautiful, yet there is no influx of artists or summer tourists. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and the strange forest presence was not laughed at, it was accustomed to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since Dunwich of 1828 was somewhat hushed up by those who had the town's and the world's welfare at heart, people shun it without knowing exactly why. Perhaps one reason, though it cannot apply to uninformed strangers, is that the natives are now repellently decadent, having gone far beyond that path of retrogression so common in so many New England backwaters. They have come to form a race by inbreeding. The average of their intelligence is woefully low, whilst their annals reek of overt viciousness and of half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds of almost unnameable violence and perversity. The old gentry, representing the 2 or 3 families came in 1772, have somewhat above the general level of decay, though many branches are sunk into the sordid populace so deeply that only their names remain as key to the origin they disgrace. Some of the Watleys and Bishops will send their eldest sons to Harvard and Miskatonic, though those sons seldom return to the moldering bramble roofs under which they and their ancestors were born. No one, even those who have had the facts concerning the recent horror, can say just what is the matter with Dunwich, though old legends speak of unhallowed rites and conclaves of the Indians, amidst which they called forbidden shapes of shadow out of the great rounded hills, and made wild orgiastic prayers that were answered by loud cracklings and rumblings from the ground below. In 1747, Reverend Abijah Hoadley came to the Congregational Church at Dunwich Village, preached a memorable sermon on a close presence of Satan and his imps, in which he said, It must be allowed that these blasphemies of an infernal train of demons are matters of too common knowledge to be denied. The cursed voices of Azrael, Berzrael, Beelzebub, and Belial, being heard now from underground by the score of credible witnesses now living. I myself did not more than a fortnight ago catch a very course of evil power in the hill in my house, and a rattling, rolling, screeching, and hissing, such as things of this earth could conjure up, and which must needs from the cave that only magic can discover, only the devil unlock. Mr. appeared soon after delivering this sermon. The text printed in Springfield is distant. Noises in the hills continue to be reported from year to year, and to geologists and physiographers. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill-crowning circles of stone pillars and rustling, airy presences to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points at the bottom of the great ravines. And while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. Then, too, the natives of the mortal are mortally afraid of the numerous whippoorwills which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are psychopomps lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer's struggling breath. If they can catch the fleeing soul when it leaves the body, they instantly flutter away, chittering in demonic laughter, but if they fail, they subside gradually into a disappointed silence. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculous because they come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any of the communities within 30 miles of it. South of one may still spot cellar walls and chimney of the ancient bishop, which was in 100 mill the falls built in 1806 from a modern piece of architecture to be seen. Industry did not flourish here, and then the 19th century factory movement proved short-lived. Oldest of all are the great rings of rough-hewn stone columns in the hilltops, but these were more generally attributed to the Indians than were the settlers. Deposits of skulls and bones found within these circles around the sizable tabletop-like rock on Sentinel Hill sustained the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places of the Pocumtucks, even though many ethnologists, disregarding the absurd improbability of such a theory, persist in believing the remains are Caucasian. It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against the hillside 4 miles from the village, and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whatley was born at 5 a.m. on Saturday, the 2nd of February, 1913. The date was recalled because it was Candlemas, in which the people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whatleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavania Whatley had no known husband, but according to the custom of their region, made no attempt to disavow the child, concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might and did speculate as wildly as they did. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about the unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavania was the only one who would be apt to mutter such things, for she was a lone creature given to wandering among thunderstorms in the hills, and trying to read the great odorous books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whatleys, and which were fast falling to pieces with age and wormholes. She had never been to school, but was filled with disjointed scraps of ancient lore that old Whatley had taught her. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whatley's reputation for black magic and the unexplained death by violence, like strange influence of Levant in grandiose daydreams and singular occupations, nor was her leisure much taken up by the household cares and home, from which all standards of order and cleanliness had long since There was hideous screaming, which echoed above even the hill noises and the dogs barking on that night. Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife preceded at his coming. Neighbors knew nothing of him till a week afterward, when old Watley drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village and discoursed incoherently to the group of loungers at Osborne's general store. There seemed to be a change in the old man, an added element of furtiveness in the clouded brain, which subtly transformed him from an object to a subject of fear, and though he was not one to be perturbed by any common family event, amidst it all he had shrewd some trace of pride later noticed by his daughter, and what he said of the child's paternity was remembered by many of the hearers years after. And I'm going to read this the way it's written. I don't care what folks think of Lavina's boy. Looked like his pa. He wouldn't look nothing like you expect. You needn't think the only folks in the folks hereabouts. Lavini's read some as seed some of the most of ye tell aboot. I calculate her man is as good a husband as ye find as his side of the Elsbury, and if of ye knowed as much about the hills as I do, you wouldn't ask no much better church wedding nor here. And let me tell you something. Someday you folks hear child of Lavini's a calling and its father's name on top of the hill of Sentinel Hill. The only person who saw Wilbur during the first month of his life were old Zachariah Watley of the undecayed Watleys and the Earl Sawyer's common-law wife, Mamie Bishop. Mamie's visit was frankly one of curiosity, and her subsequent tales did justice to her observations. But Zachariah came to lead a pair of Alderney cows which old Watley had bought of his son Curtis. This marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying on part of small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928, when the Dunwich horror came and went, and yet at no time did the ramshackle Watley barn seem overcrowded with livestock. There came a period when people were cautious enough to steal up and count the herd that grazed precariously on the steep hillside above the farmhouse, and they could never find more than 10 or 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens. Evidently some blight or distemper perhaps sprung from the unwholesome pasture, or the diseased fungi and timbers of the filthy barn, caused a heavy mortality above the Watley animals. Odd wounds or sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to infect the visible cattle, and once or twice, during the earliest months, certain callers fancied themselves they could discern similar sores on the throats of the gray, unshaven old man and his slatternly, crinkle-haired albino daughter. In the spring after Wilbur's birth, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing in her misproportioned arms the swarthy child. Public interest in the Watley subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered to comment on the swift development which newcomer seemed every day to present. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal. Within 3 months of his birth he had attained a size and muscle not usually found in infants. Under a full his motions and his vocal sounds shewed a restraint and deliberateness highly peculiar in an infant, and no one was really unprepared when at 7 months old he began to walk unassisted with things which officials remove. It was somewhat after this time on Halloween, that's tonight, that a great blaze was seen at midnight on the top of Sentinel Hill, where the old table-like stone stands amidst its tumultuous and ancient bones. Considerable talk started when Silas Bishop of the and having the boy that his mother about an hour before the blaze was remarked. Silas was rounding up stray heifer, but he nearly forgot his mission when he fleetingly spied the two figures in the dim light of his lantern. They darted almost noiselessly through the underbrush, and the astonished watcher seemed to think that they were entirely unclothed. Afterwards he could not be sure about the boy, but... Sorry, I lost my place. who may have been some kind of who maybe had some kind of a fringed belt and a pair of dark trunks or trousers on. Wilbur was subsequently seen alive and conscious without complete and tightly buttoned attire, the disarrangement of threatened disarrangement of which he always seemed to fill him with anger and alarm. His contrast with his squalid mother and grandfather in this respect was thought very notable until the horror of 1928 suggested the most valid of reasons. The next January, gossips were mildly interested in the fact that Lavini's black brat had commenced to talk, and at the age of only 11 months, his speech was somewhat remarkable because of its difference from ordinary accents of the region and because it displayed a freedom from infantile lispings of which many children of 3 or 4 might be proud. The boy was not talkative, yet when he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and its denizens. The strangers did not reside in what he said, or even in simple idioms he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his intonation or with the internal organs that produced the spoken sounds. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precociously shaped nose united with the expression of his large, dark, almost Latin eyes to give him an air of quasi-adulthood, and well-nigh preternatural intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly, despite his appearance of brilliancy, and being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large pored yellowish skin, coarse crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. He was soon disliked even more decidedly than his mother and grandshire, and all conjectures about him were spiced with references to the bygone magic of old Whatley, and how the hills once shook when they shrieked the dreadful name of Yog Sothoth in the midst of stone, and with a great book open in his arms before him. Dogs abhorred the boy, and they always take various defensive measures against their barking menace. Meanwhile, old Whatley continued to buy cattle without measurably increasing the size of the herd. He also cut timber and began to repair the unused parts of his house, a spacious peaked-roofed affair whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside, and whose 3 least ruined ground floor room been sufficient for a daughter. There must be reserves in the old man to accomplish hardly dementedly carpentry effects of sound calculation. It always as soon as it had already begun as soon as Wilbur was born, when one of the many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, with lock. Restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was a no less thorough craftsman. His mania shewed itself only in his tight boarding up of all the windows in the reclaimed section, though many declared it was a crazy thing to bother with the reclamation at all, less was his fitting up of another downstairs room for his new grandson. A room which several callers saw, though no one ever admitted to the closely boarded up upper story. This chamber he lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began to gradually arrange in apparent careful order all the rotting ancient books and parts of books, which during his own day had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of various rooms. I made some use of him, he would say, as he tried to mend a torn black letter page with paste prepared on a rusty kitchen stove. But the boy's fitting to make better use of 'em. He'd orter have 'em and well sought for his kin, for they goin' to be all of his larnin'. And when Wilbur was a year and 7 months old in September of 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. He had grown as large as a child of 4, and he was fluent and an incredibly intelligent talker. He ran freely around the fields and hills, accompanying his mother on all her wanderings. At home, he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Whatley would instruct and chastise him through long, hushed afternoons. By this time, the restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gable end, close up against the hill, where no one would imagine why a cleated wooden runway was built up to it from the ground. About the period of this work's completion, people noticed that the old tool house, tightly locked and windowlessly clapboarded since Wilbur's birth, had been abandoned again. The door swung listlessly open, and when Earl Sawyer once stepped within after a castle selling call on Old Whatley, he was quite discomposed by the singular odor he encountered. Such a stench, he averred, and he had never smelt it in all of his life except near the Indian circles on the hills, where he could not come from anything sane or of this earth. But then the homes and sheds of Dunwich folk have never been remarkable for olfactory immaculateness. In other words, they're saying it stinks bad. Like me. No, I'm just kidding. The following months were void of visible events, save that everyone swore to a slow but steady increase of the mysterious hill noises. On May Eve of 1915, there were tremors which even the Aylesbury people felt, whilst the following Halloween produced an underground rumbling queerly synchronized with bursts of flame. And then which Whatley's doing from the summit of Sentinel Hill. Wilbur was growing up uncannily, so that he looked like a boy of 10 as he entered his 4th year. He read avidly by himself and talked much less than formerly his 4th year. He read avidly by himself. He talked less than formerly. A settled taciturnity was absorbing him, and for the first time people began to speak specifically of the dawning look of evil in his goatish face. He would sometimes mutter in unfamiliar jargon and chant in bizarre rhythms which chilled the listener with a sense of unexplainable terror. The aversion displayed towards him by dogs had now become a matter of wide remark. He was obliged to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. His occasional use of the weapon did not enhance his popularity among the owners of canine guardians. What an asshole. Few callers of his home would often find Lavinia alone on the ground floor, while odd cries and footsteps resounded in the boarded-up second story. She would never tell that her father and the boy were doing up there, though once she turned pale and displayed an abnormal degree of fear when a jocose fish peddler tried the locked door leading to the stairway. The peddler told the store loungers at Dunwich Village that he thought he heard a horse stamping on the floors above. The loungers reflected, thinking of the door in the runway and of the cattle that so swiftly disappeared. Then they shuddered as they recalled tales of old Whatley's youth and the strange things that were called out of the earth when a bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. It had for some time been noticed that the dogs began to hate and fear the whole Whatley place as violently as they hated and feared young Wilbur personally. In 1917, the war came, and Squire Sawyer Whatley, as a chairman of the local draft board, had a hard time finding a quota of young Dunwich men fit to even send to development camp. The government, alarmed at such signs of wholesale regional decadence, sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was the publicity attending the investigation which set reporters on the track of the Whatleys and caused the Boston Globe and the Arkham Advertiser to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precociousness, old Whatley's black magic, and the shelves of strange books in the sealed second story of the ancient farmhouse, and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noises. Wilbur was 4.5 then, and he looked like a lad of 15. His lips and cheeks were fuzzy with coarse dark down, and his voice had begun to break. Earl Sawyer went out to the Whatley place with both sets of reporters and cameramen, and called their attention to the queer stench which now seemed to trickle down from the sealed upper spaces. It was, he said, exactly like a smell he had found in the tool shed abandoned when a house was finally repaired, and like the faint odors which he had sometimes thought he caught near the stone circles on the mountains. Dunwich folk read the story when they appeared and grinned over the obvious mistakes. They wondered too why the writers made so much of the fact that old Watley always paid for his cattle in gold pieces of extremely ancient date. The Watleys had received some of their visitors with ill-concealed distaste, though they did not dare court further publicity by a violent resistance or refusal to talk. For a decade, the annals of the Watleys sink indistinguishably into the general life of a morbid community, used to their queer ways and hard work, and hardened to their May Eve and All Hallows orgies. Twice a year they would light fires on top of Sentinel Hill, at which times the mountain rumblings would recur with greater and greater, while at all seasons there were strainings at the times in the when the family were downstairs. They wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullocks was usually sacrificed. There was talk of a complaint to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but nothing ever came of it, since Dunwich folk are never anxious to call the outside world attention to themselves. About 1923, when Wilbur was a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave the impressions of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peaked roof. They had torn down the great central chimney too, and fitted the rusty range with a flimsy outside tin stovepipe. In the spring after this event, old Watley noticed that the growing number of whippoorwills would come out of the cold spring glen to chirp under the window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance, and told the loungers at Osborne's that he thought that his time had almost come. "And they whistle just in tune with my breathin' now," he said, "and I guess they're gettin' ready to catch my soul. They know it's a-goin' out, and don't calculate to miss it. You'll all know, boys, arter I'm gone, whether or not they get me or not. If they do, they'll keep a-singin' and laughin' till they break a day. If they don't, they'll kinder down like I expect them and the souls they hunt for have pretty tough tussle sometimes." On Lammas night 1924, Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury had been hastily summoned by Wilbur Watley, who had lashed his one remaining horse through the darkness and telephoned from Osborne's into the village. He found old Watley in a very grave state, with a cardiac action and stertorous breathing that told of an end not far off. The shapeless albino daughter and oddly bearded grandson stood by the bedside, whilst from a vacant abyss overhead there came a disquieting suggestion of a rhythmic surging or lapping, as of the waves of some level beach. The doctor, though, was chiefly disturbed by the chattering night birds outside, a seemingly limitless legion of whippoorwills that cried their endless message and repetitious, timed diabolically to the wheezing gasps of the dying man. It was uncanny and unnatural, too much, thought Dr. Houghton, like the whole of the region he had entered so reluctantly in response to the urgent call. Towards 1 o'clock, old Watley gained consciousness and interrupted the wheezing to choke out a few words to his grandson. "More space, Willie. More space soon. Ye grows, and that grows faster. It'll be ready to sarve ye soon, boy. Open the gates to Yog Sothoth and the long chant that you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition, and then put a match to the prison. Fire and from earth can't burn itself now." He was obviously quite mad. During a pause which the flock of whippoorwills outside adjusted their cries to the altered tempo, while some indications of the strange hill noises came from afar off, he added another sentence or two. "Feed it regular, Willie, and mind the quantity, but don't let it grow too fast for the place, for if it bursts quarters or gets out before ye opens to Yog Sothoth, it's all over and no use. Only then from beyond can to make it multiply and work. Only then the oldens want us to come back. But speech gave place to gasps again. Lavinia screamed at the way the whippoorwills followed the change. It was the same for more than an hour when the final throaty rattle came. Dr. Houghton drew sunken lids over the glazing gray eyes as the tumult of birds faded imperceptibly to silence. Lavinia sobbed, but Wilbur only chuckled whilst the noises rumbled faintly. They didn't get him, he muttered in his heavy bass voice. And this is a 10-year-old we're talking about, remember. Wilbur, by this time a scholar of a really tremendous erudition in his one-sided way, was quietly known by correspondents to many librarians in distant places where rare and forbidden books of old days are kept. He was more and more hated and dreaded around Dunwich because of a certain youthful disappearance which suspicion lay vaguely at his door. But he was always able to silence inquiry through fear or through use of that fund of old-time gold, which still, as in his grandfather's time, went forth regularly and increasingly for cattle buying. He was now tremendously mature of aspect, and his height, having reached the normal adult limit, seemed inclined to wax beyond that figure. In 1925, when a scholarly correspondent from Miskatonic University called upon him one day and then departed, pale and puzzled, he was fully 6 3/4 of a foot tall. Goodness. Through all the years, Wilbur had treated his half-deformed albino mother with growing contempt, finally forbidding her to go to the hills with him on Maeve and Hallowmas. And in 1926, the poor creature complained to Mamie Bishop of being afraid of him. "There's more about him than I knows than I can tell you, Mamie. And nowadays there's more nor I know myself. I vow afore God, I know not what he wants nor what he's trying to do." That Halloween, the hill noises sounded louder than ever, and fires burned on Sentinel Hill as usual, but people paid more attention to the rhythmic screaming of the vast flocks of unnatural, belated whippoorwills which seemed to be assembled near the unlighted Watley farmhouse. After midnight, their shrill notes burst into a kind of pandemonic, man, that's a big word, cachinnation, which filled all of the countryside, and not until dawn did they finally quiet down. Then they vanished, hurrying southward, where they were fully a month overdue. What this meant no one could quite be certain till later. None of the country folks seemed to have died, but poor Lavernia, the twisted albino, was never seen again. In the summer of 1923, Wilbur repaired the 2 sheds in the farmhouse and began moving his books and effects out of them. Soon afterwards, Earl Sawyer told the loungers at the Osbornes that more carpentry was going on in the Watley farmhouse. Wilbur was closing all the doors and windows on the ground floor and seemed to be taking out the partitions he and his grandfather had done upstairs 4 years before. He was living in one of the sheds, and Sawyer thought he seemed unusually worried and tremulous. People generally suspected him of knowing something about his mother's disappearance, and very few ever approached his neighborhood now. His height had increased no more than 7 feet and shewed no signs of ceasing its development. The following winter brought an event no less strange than Wilbur's first trip outside the Dunwich region. Correspondence with the Widener Library at Harvard, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Museum, the University of Buenos Aires, and the library of Miskatonic University of Arkham had failed to get him the loan of a book he desperately wanted. So at length he set out in person, shabby, dirty, bearded, and uncouth of dialect, to consult the copy of Miskatonic, which was the nearest to him geographically. At almost 8 feet tall, and carrying a cheap new valise from Osborne's general stores, this dark and goatish gargoyle appeared one day in Arkham, in quest of the dreaded volume kept under lock and key at the college library. The hideous Necronomicon of the man Arab Abdul Azarid in the oldest, warmest Latin version, as printed in Spain in the 17th century. He had never seen a city before, but had no thought safe to find his way to the university grounds, where indeed he passed heedlessly by the great white-fanged watchdog that barked with unusual fury and enmity, and tugged frantically at its stout chain. Wilbur had with him the priceless but imperfect copy of Dr. D's English version, which his grandfather had bequeathed him, and upon receiving access to the Latin copy, he at once began to collate the two texts with the aim of discovering a certain passage, which would have come on the 751st page of his own defective volume. This much he could not civilly refrain from telling the librarian, the same erudite Henry Armitage, who had once called at his farm, and who now politely piled him with questions. He was looking, he had to admit, for some kind of formula or incantation containing the frightful name Yog-Sothoth, and it puzzled him to find discrepancies, duplications, and ambiguities which made the matter of determination far from easy. He copied the formula he finally chose. Dr. Armitage looked involuntarily over his shoulder at the open pages, at the left hand of which in the Latin version contains such monstrous threats to peace and sanity of the world. Nor it is to be thought, ran the text as Armitage mentally translated it, the men or the earth's masters, or the common bulk of life and substance walks alone. The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be, not in the spaces we know, but between them. They walk serene and primal, undimensional and to us unseen. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and the guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. He knows where the old ones broke through of the old, and where they shall break through again. He knows where they have trod earth's fields, and where they will still tread them, and why no one can behold them as they tread. By their smell can man sometimes know them near, but not of their semblance can no man know, saving only in features of those they have begotten of mankind, and of those are there many sorts, differing in the likeness from man's truest eidolon, to that shape without sight or substance, which is them. They walk unseen and foul in lonely places where the words have been spoken and the rites held through at their seasons. The wind gibbers with their voices, and the earth mutters with their conscience. They bend the forest and crush the city, yet may not forest or city behold them, the hand that smites. Cadath in cold waste hath known them, and what man knows Cadath? The ice desert of the south and the sunken isles of the ocean hold stones whereon their seal is engraven, but who hath seen the deep frozen city, or the sealed tower long garlanded with seaweed and barnacles? Great Cthulhu is their cousin, and yet he can spy them only dimly. Ea Shub Nigrath, as foul as shall ye know them. They're at your throats, and yet see them not. Their habitations is even one with your threshold. Yog-Sothoth is the key to the gate, whereby the spheres meet. Man rules now where they ruled once, and they shall soon rule where man rules now. Where summer, and after summer is winter, and after winter summer, they wait patient and potent, for here shall they reign again. Dr. Armitage, associating what he was reading with what he had heard of Dunwich and its brooding presences, and of what Walter Brimley and of Walter Brimley and his dim hidden aura that stretched from a dubious birth to a cloud of probable matricide, felt a wave of fright as tangible as a drought of the tomb's cold clamminess. The bent goatish giant before him seemed like a spawn of another planet or dimension, like something only partly of mankind and linked to black gulfs of essence and entity that stretch like titan phantasms beyond all spheres of force and matter, space and time. Presently Wilbur raised his head and began speaking in that strange resonant fashion which hinted at sound-producing organs unlike the rest of mankind's. "Mr. Armitage," he said, "I calculate I've got to take that book home. There's things in it that I gotta try to under certain conditions I can't get here, and it'd be a mortal sin to let a red tape rule to hold me up. So let me take it along, sir, and I'll swat that nobody will know the difference. I done need to tell you I'll take good care of it. I wouldn't want to put this copy in... Wait, I won't me... Oh, I can't... It's like kind of like a weird dialect. It won't me that put this D copy in the shape it's in." He stopped as he saw firm denial on the library's face, and his own goatish features grew crafty. Armitage, half ready to tell him where he might make a copy of what parts he needed, thought suddenly of the possible consequences and checked himself. There's too much responsibility in giving such a being the key to such blasphemous outer spheres. Whatley saw how things stood and tried to answer lightly. "Well, all right. If you feel that way about it, maybe Harvard won't be so fussy as you be." And without saying more, he rose and strode out of the building, stooping at each doorway. Armitage heard the savage yelping of the great watchdog and studied Whatley's gorilla-like lope as he crossed the bit of campus visible from the window. He thought of the wild tales he had heard and recalled that the old Sunday stories in the Advertiser, these things and the lore he had picked up from the Dunwich rustics and villagers during his one visit there, unseen things not of Earth, at least not of tri-dimensional Earth, rushed foetid and horrible through New England lands and brooded obscenely on the mountain tops. Of this he had long felt certain. Now he seemed to sense the close presence of some terrible part of intruding horror, and to glimpse a hellish advance in the black dominion of the ancient and once passive nightmare. He locked away the Necronomicon with a shudder of disgust, but the room still reeked with an unholy and unidentifiable stench. "It wasn't me. As a foulness shall he know them," he quoted. Yet the odor was the same as that which had sickened him at the Whatley farmhouse less than 3 years before. He thought of Wilbur, goatish and ominous once again, and laughed mockingly at the village's numerous rumors of his parentage. "Inbreeding," Armitage muttered half aloud to himself. "Great God, what simpletons! Shew them the Arthur Machen's great God plan, and they'll think it's a common Dunwich scandal. But what cursed, shapeless influence on or off this three-dimensioned earth was Whatley, Wilbur Whatley's father? Born on Candlemas more than 9 months after May Eve of 1912, when the talk about the queer earth noises reached clear to Arkham, almost said Gotham. What walked on the mountains that May night? What rude horror fastened itself onto the world in such half human flesh and blood? During the ensuing weeks, Dr. Armitage set about to collect as much possible data on Wilbur Whatley and the former presences around Dunwich. Got in communication with Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury, who had attended old Whatley in his late illness, and found much to ponder over in the grandfather's last words, as quoted by the physician. A visit to Dunwich village failed to bring out much that was new, but a close survey of the Necronomicon in those parts, which Wilbur had sought so avidly, seemed to supply new and terrible clues to the nature, methods, and desires of the strange evil so vaguely threatening this planet. Talks with several students of archaic lore in Boston and letters, so many others elsewhere, gave him a growing amazement which passed slowly through the varied degrees of alarm to a state of really acute spiritual fear, as the summer dew on the felt dimly that something ought to be done about the lurking terrors of upper Miskatonic Valley, and about the monstrous being known to the human world as Wilbur Whatley. The Dunwich horror itself came between Lammas and Equinox in 1928, and Dr. Armitage was among those who witnessed its monstrous prologue. He had heard meanwhile of Whatley's grotesque trip to Cambridge, and of his frantic efforts to borrow or copy from the Necronomicon at the Widner Library. Those efforts had been in vain, since Armitage had issued warnings of the keenest intensity To all librarians having charge of the dreaded volume, Wilbur had been shockingly nervous at Cambridge, anxious for the book, yet almost equally anxious to get home again, as if he feared the results of being away long. Early in August, the half-expected outcome developed in the small hours of the 3D. Dr. Armitage, I don't know what that means. The 3D. Is that like 3 in the morning? Oh, whatever. Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling, half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but then with the hideous, significant pauses. Then there rang out screams from a wholly different throat, such a scream as roused half the sleepers in Arkham and haunted their dreams ever afterward, such a scream as could come from no being born of the earth or wholly of earth. Armitage, hastening into some clothing and rushing across the street and lawn into the college building, saw that others were ahead of him and heard the echoes of the burglar alarm still shrilling from the library. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. What had come had indeed completed its entrance, for the barking and screaming, now fast fading into a mixed low growling and moaning, produced unmistakably from within. Some instinct warned Armitage that what was taking place was not a thing for unfortunate eyes to see, so he brushed back the crowd with authority as he unlocked the vestibule door. Among the others he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had told some of the conjectures and misgivings, and these two he motioned to accompany him inside. The inward sounds, except for a watchful droning whine from the dog, had by this time subsided, but Armitage now perceived with a sudden start that such a loud chorus of whippoorwills among the shrubbery had commenced a damnably rhythmical popping, as if in unison with the last breaths of a dying man. The building was full of a frightful stench, which Dr. Armitage knew too well, and the three men rushed across the hall to the small genealogical reading room, whence the low whining came. For a second nobody dared to turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the three, it is not certain which, shrieked aloud at what was sprawled before them among disordered tables and overturned books. Professor Rice declared that he wholly lost consciousness for an instant, though he did not stumble or fall. The thing that lay half bent on the floor in the fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitching silently and spasmically, while his chest heaved its monstrous unison with the mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside. Bits of shoe leather and fragments of apparel were scattered around the room, and just inside the window an empty canvas sex lay where it had evidently been thrown. Near the central desk, a revolver had fallen, a dented but undischarged cartridge later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images in the time. It would be trite and not wholly accurate to say that no human pen could describe it, but one may properly say that it could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and contour are too closely bound up within the common life forms of this planet and of the three known dimensions. It was partly human, beyond a doubt, with very manlike hands and head. The goatish chinless face had the stamp of the Watleys upon it, but the torso and lower parts of the body were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could have ever enabled it to walk on earth unchallenged or uneradicated. Man, I know that feeling. I need big pants. Above the waist was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog's rending paws still rested watchfully, had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, and dimly suggested that the squamish covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblances left off, and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded limply. The arrangement was odd, and seemed to follow the symmetries of some cosmic geometry unknown to Earth or even the solar system. On each of the hips, deep-set in kind of a pinkish, chelated orbit, was what seemed to be rudimentary eyes, whilst in lieu of a tail there depended a kind of trunk or feeler with a purple annular markings and many evidences of being undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for the black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of a prehistoric Earth's saurons and terminated in ridgy, veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tails and tentacles rhythmically changed color, as if from some circulatory cause normal to the non-human side of its ancestry. In the tentacles, this was observable as deepening of the greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was manifested as a yellowish appearance which alternated with sickly grayish white in the spaces between the purple rings. Of genuine blood there was none, only the fetid greenish-yellow ichor which trickled along the painted floor beyond the radius of the stickiness and left a curious discoloration behind it. As the presence of the three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Dr. Armitage made no written record of its mouthings, but asserts confidently that nothing in English was uttered. At first the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of Earth, but towards the last there came some disjointed fragments, evidently taken from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blasphemy in quest of which the thing had perished. These fragments, as Armitage recalled them, ran something like this: Nagai, Naga, Naga, Bug Shogoth, Yaha, Yog Sogtoth, Yog Sogtoth. They trailed off into nothingness as the whippoorwill shrieked in rhythmical crescendos of unholy anticipation. Then came a halt in the gasping, and the dog raised its head in a long, lugubrious howl. A change came over the yellow goatish face of the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell in appallingly. Outside the windows the shrilling of the whippoorwills had suddenly ceased, and above the murmurings of the gathering crowd there came the sound of a panic-struck whirring and fluttering. Against the moon-cast clouds of feathery watchers rose and raced from sight, frantic at what they had sought for prey. All at once the dog started up abruptly and gave a frightened bark, and leapt nervously out the window by which it had entered. A cry from the crowd, and Dr. Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted until the police or the medical examiner arrive. He was thankful that the windows were just too high to permit of peering in, and drew the dark curtains carefully down over each one. By the time 2 policemen arrived, and Dr. Morgan, meeting them in the vestibule, was urging them for their own sakes to postpone entrance to the stench-filled reading room till the examiner came and the prostrate thing could be covered up. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. One need not describe the kind and rate of shrinkage and disintegration that occurred before the eyes of Dr. Armitage and Professor Rice, but it is permissible to say, aside from the external appearance of the face and hands, the really human element in Wilbur Whatley must have been very small. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky whitish mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently Whatley had no skull or bony skeletons, at least in any true or stable sense. He had taken somewhat after his unknown father. Yet all of this was only the prologue of the actual Dunwich horror. Formalities were gone through by bewildered officials, abnormal details were duly kept from press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Aylesbury to look up property and notify any who might be the heirs of the late Wilbur Whatley. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the domed hills, and because of the unwanted stench and the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the empty shell formed by Whatley's boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended to be horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute sense of the nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine the survey of the deceased living quarters and newly mended sheds to a single visit. They filed a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning heirship and are said to be still in progress among the innumerable Watleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost interminable manuscript and strange characters written in a huge ledger and adjudged of some sort of diary because of the spacing and variations in ink and penmanship presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it on the old bureau, which served as the owner's desk. After a few weeks of debate, it was sent to Miskatonic University along with the deceased collections of strange books for study and possible translation, but even the best linguists soon saw that it was not likely to be unriddled with these. No trace of ancient gold with which Wilbur and old Whatley always paid their debts has yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had become pronounced during the evening. The dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's between Cold Spring Glen and the village, rushed frantically back from his morning trip to 10-acre meadow with the cows. He almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen, and in the yard the no less frightened herd were pawing and lowing pitifully. Having followed the boy back in panic, they shared with him. Between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Mr. Corey. "Up there, in the rud, beyond the glen, Mr. Corey. They's something been there. It smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees pushed back from the rud like they'd a house been moved along it. And that ain't the worst neither. There's prints in the rud, Miss Corey. Great round prints as big as barrel heads, all sunk down deep like an elephant had been along. Only there's been a sight no more than 4 feet could make. I looked at the one or two afore I run, and I see even more. One was covered with lines spreading out from the place, like a big palm leaf fan, 2 or 3 times as big as any they is. Had of been pounded down into the rud, and the smell was awful, like what it was around the wizard house of Whatley." Here he faltered, and seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had sent him flying home. Miss Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its round the overture of panic and heralded major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to the Whatleys, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit. For Sally's boy Chauncey, who had slept poorly, had been up on the hill towards Whatley's, and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place and at the pasturage where Miss Bishop's cows had been left out all night. "Yes, Miss Corey," came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire. "Chancey just come back from a post, and they couldn't have been for being scared. He said old Whatley's house is all blowed up and the timber scattered round like they'd been dynamite inside. Only the bottom floor ain't been through, but it's all covered in some kind of tar-like stuff that smells awful and drips down among the ages into the ground where the side timbers is blown away. And they's awful kinder marks in the yard, too. Great round marks, bigger round than a hogshead and all sticky with stuff, like the one in the blowed-up house. Chancey said he leads off into the meadows, where a great swath wider than a barn is matted down, and all the stone walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. And he says he, Miss Corey, as how he sought to look for Seth's cows, frightened as he was, and found 'em in the upper pasture nigh the devil's hop yard in an awful shape. Half on 'em's clean, and nigh half of 'em's left and sucked most dry of blood, with sores on 'em like they been on Whatley's cattle ever since Lavinia's black brat was born. Seth's he's gone now to look at 'em, though I vow he won't care to get very nigh Wizard Whatley's. Chancey didn't look very cheerful, ter he wore big matted down swath led outer it left the pasturage, but he says he thinks it pinted towards the Glen Rood to the village. I tell ye, Miss Corey. They's something abroad. It's hard reading this. As hadn't order he had been abroad, and I for one think that Black Wilbur Watley, as he come to the bad end he deserved, is at the bottom of the breeding of it. How much of this is there? This hurts to read. I think he and old Watley must have raised something in their nailed up house, as he ain't even so human as he was. And they allus been a seen things around Dunwich, living things, as ain't human and ain't good for human folks. The groanin' was a talkin' last night, and towards mornin' chancey he heard the whippoorwill so loud in Colorado Spring Glen he couldn't sleep none, and then he thought he heard another faint-like sound over towards Wilbur Watley's, and kinder rippin' and tearin' a wood, like some big box or crate being opened far off. What with that, he didn't get no sleep at all till sunup, and no sooner as he was up this morning as he got over to Watley's and see what's the matter. He see enough, I tell you, Miss Corey. It ain't done mean no good, and I think it was all the men folks ought to get up, party, and do something. I know something awful's about, and feel my time is nigh, though only God knows just what it is. Did your Luther take account of where those big tracks led to? No, Miss Corey. If they was on the Glen Road to the side of the Glen and got to your house yet, I calculate they'd go into the Glen itself, and they would do that. ILS says Coral Spring Glen ain't no healthy place or decent place. The whippoorwills no fireflies there, never did act like they were creatures of God, and then as says ye can hear them strange things a rushin' and a talkin' in the air down there in the stand in the right place, atween the rock falls and Bear's Den. By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the new-made Watley ruins and the cold Glen Spring. I called that Colorado earlier. Oops. Examining in the horror of vast monstrous prints the maimed bishop cattle, the strange noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised matted vegetation of the fields and the roadsides. Whatever had burst loose upon that world had assuredly gone down into the great sinister ravine, for all of the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and the great avenue had been gouged into the precipice, hanging underbrush. It was as though a house launched by an avalanche had slid down the tangled growths of the almost vertical slopes. From below no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable fotor, and is not to be wondered at that men preferred to stay on the edge and argue rather than descend. And bared the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were worth the party had barked furiously at first, but they seemed cowed and reluctant when they neared the glen. Someone telephoned the news at the Aylesbury transcript, but the editor, accustomed to the wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterwards reproduced by the Associated Press. That night everyone went home, and every home, house, and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in the open pasturage. About 2 a.m, a frightful stench and savage barking of the dogs awakened the household of Elmer Fry's on the eastern edge of Cold Spring Glen, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping from somewhere outside. Mrs. Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise of splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came apparently from the barn, and was quickly followed by a hideous screaming and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but he knew it would be death to go out into that black farmyard. The children and women folk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure vestigial instinct of defense which told them that their lives depended on silence. At last the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful moaning, and a great snapping, cracking, and crashing ensued. The Frys huddled together in the sitting room and did not dare to move until the last echoes died away far down into the cold spring glen. Then, amidst the dismal moans from the stable and the demonic pipings of the late whippoorwills in the glen, Selena Fry trotted to the phone and spread what she could about the second phase of the horror. The next day, all of the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan swaths of destruction stretched from the glen to the Fry farmyard, monstrous prints covering the bare patches of ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. Some of those were in curious fragments, and all that had survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Arkham, but others maintained they would be of no use. Old Zebulon Watley, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where traditions ran strong, and his memories of chanting in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside too passive or organized for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in gloom under one roof, but in general there were only one of repetition and barricading of the night before, and a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day came, there were many who hoped that the new horror had gone as swiftly as it had come. And there were many, even brave souls, who proposed an offensive expedition down in the glen, though they did not venture to set such an example to the still reluctant majority. How many more pages is this? I forget how long this is.
I'd like another scary story.
Huh?
I would like another scary story.
Yeah, there are still... Man, it ends on page 666. That's funny. So we've got about 12 pages left. But this is the end of a part of this short story. So why don't we pause on this story and we'll come back to it, I guess, at the end and finish it up. So let's pause for I want Cameron to read us his creepypasta that he is that he loves so much.
Bring Jaime into this, because I know he wants to hear this.
Yeah, where is he?
He
Dang it.
I want him to come back.
Yeah, we'll continue the Dunwich horror.
The Dundovich.
So now I'm
The peace and quiet from the Fireside.
I'm going to pass things over to Kenneth Kamsey, my co-host, partner in crime, and whatnot.
Hello.
And I hope that everyone is enjoying this night so far. Hopefully the stream is still going. I don't know if anybody in chat has spoken or said anything.
Let me see. I believe Sansama and Kirdolia were here earlier. They were commenting on how the mic kept coming on and off, but you, for the most part, seems to be stable.
Okay, good.
I would not know.
Is anybody still here?
Well, let's see. Sound off. Anybody here? I can't tell who's on chat from mobile. I'm not sure. But regardless, I'd be honored to read a story.
Yeah, for one
But
thing.
let's get Jaime out here. I want him to hear my story.
Yeah, for one thing, I wanna rest my pipes for a moment because this is
I imagine
trying.
you did a whole lot of reading.
Yep. Forgot how long it was, and plus, like when you just sit and read it, it doesn't take nearly as long as when you read it out loud.
That's true. I mean, when you read it to yourself, you scan it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Is Jaime coming? Well, I can't read the story without him.
He's pretty,
I need his energy.
He's what?
he's pretty passed out.
Please.
Well, shit.
I promise this is a short story. and it might amuse him. Oh wait, it's not supposed to be amusing. It's a scary story. Ooh.
Oh, anyway, just come read it, even if he doesn't wake up. Here's the lavalier mic.
Okay. May as well show my face for the camera this one time.
Like, he might be coming.
I mean, do you need your glasses to read?
Not really.
Here, before you show your face, then. Here, put this on.
Oh, there you go.
Take your glasses
That's
off and put it on.
perfect. Yeah. Do not adjust your set, folks. I'll be there in just a second. I'm gonna dress up like a bunny.
I'm not funny. That's a splicer.
Okay, a splicer.
40 splices.
Holy splicer. Oh, goodness. Very toasty in here. Hello, everybody. I wonder if you can see me. Have you checked for disease? Where should I pin this? I guess up here?
Right there.
You want to do a sound check for me to see if I sound okay? I don't want this to get in the way of my voice. Alright, if you're listening to me on mobile, I'll talk for a little bit. Hey, Sansoma's still here. Zappa's here too.
You sound good.
Hello, Zappa. Hello, Sansoma. In case you missed earlier, we're taking a little short break from... What was the name of the H.P. Lovecraft story?
The Dunwich Horror.
The Dunwich Horror. We're about more than halfway through, but there's like 12 pages left, so he's going to save for the very end. I don't know at what time he put in the Spooky Tale anthology. I imagine midnight or so. But he's going to take a little break, rest his pipes, drink some water. We're going to get Pai Mei out here. And I've got a very interesting creepypasta I wanted to share with the world. So, and to introduce myself, hi, I'm Candid Camsey. Sweet Merlot is running the board as a moderator. You may have caught me earlier playing Dread X Collection 3, 12 game jams based on the spoopy theme. The Dunwich Shitter. Not quite. Oh, and Zappa was there. Good to see you again, man. Some games stood out more than others, and it was a shame that the game bugged out. What happened was, something was supposed to happen after beating the first game. The mask is muffling me, isn't it? Okay, I'm gonna raise it up just a little bit. How about now?
You're good.
There we go. Very good. Anyway, something was supposed to trigger after beating the first game, but for some reason, it never happened. So I was unable to progress in the castle. So I had to play each game,
Free play.
yeah, individually. And most I've beaten. Some I just couldn't. Whether it be to my patience or the way the game's designed, I don't know. But Pai Mei's here. The king is resting his pipes, having an energy drink, and I'm knocking my mask into this lantern.
Oh, shit.
I apologize for that.
Glasses.
Oh yeah, don't sit on my glasses. Those are expensive. Did you sit on them?
I did.
Oh,
They're okay though. I didn't like.
Majesty! I'm supposed to look intimidating, but now you see a whining bunny on your throne. An assistant nightmare is raiding with a party of 5. That's perfect. Welcome, guys. You are just in time for the story of the century. Okay, are they okay?
They seem okay.
I hope you didn't break them too much. Okay,
I felt resistance.
chat, friends, gather around. I have a creepypasta I want to share with you that is written by Chris O'Neill, who you may know on the internet as Oni NG. He also does